I watched in horror as Sheriff Karen pulled out her lighter and flicked it open. My disabled son Tommy sat helpless in his wheelchair, tears streaming down his face as she moved closer to the custom mobility device that had taken us months to afford. The flames caught the fabric seat first, then spread to the armrests. "This is what happens to burdens on society," she said with a cold smile, stepping back as the wheelchair became an inferno. Tommy screamed and tried to crawl away from the burning metal. That was the moment I knew Sheriff Karen had crossed a line she could never uncross. What she did not know was that I had the power to destroy her career with a single phone call. My name is David, and for 3 years I lived the quiet life of a single father in Millbrook, a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business. Every morning started the same way. I would wake up at 6:30, make coffee, and then help my 12-year-old son Tommy get ready for school. Tommy was born with spina bifida, which meant he needed a wheelchair to get around. But that never stopped him from being the brightest kid I knew. His custom wheelchair was more than just mobility equipment. It was his independence, his freedom, and his connection to the world around him. "Dad, can we go to the park after school?" Tommy would ask me every Tuesday, because Tuesdays were when the local kids played basketball at the community center. He loved watching them play, cheering from the sidelines with more enthusiasm than most people showed for anything. The people of Millbrook seemed nice enough at first. Mrs. Henderson from the grocery store always saved Tommy the best apples. Mr. Garcia at the hardware store would let Tommy help organize the small screws and bolts. These simple kindnesses made our life feel normal and safe. What nobody in Millbrook knew was that I was not just another single dad trying to make ends meet. I was actually Police Chief David Morrison from the neighboring county, working undercover on a regional corruption investigation. My real job required me to keep a low profile and blend into small-town life, while gathering intelligence on several connected cases. Every evening after Tommy went to bed, I would sit at my kitchen table and review case files, phone records, and surveillance reports. The work was important, but nothing mattered more to me than making sure Tommy felt loved and protected. He had already faced enough challenges in his young life. Our routine was simple but meaningful. School drop-offs, afternoon homework sessions, weekend trips to the lake, and Sunday morning pancakes that Tommy insisted on making himself. He was learning to be independent despite his physical limitations, and I was proud of his determination. I thought we had found our perfect place in this quiet town. The rent was affordable, the schools were decent, and most importantly, Tommy seemed happy. He had started making friends and talking about joining the chess club. For the first time in years, we both felt like we belonged somewhere. Looking back now, I realize how naive I was to think we could live peacefully under the radar forever. Small towns have their own power structures, their own bullies, and their own ways of deciding who belongs and who does not. We were about to learn that lesson the hard way. The first time I met Sheriff Karen Walsh, I was helping Tommy fix a broken wheel on his wheelchair outside the town library. It was a Thursday afternoon in September, and the autumn air was crisp and clean. Tommy had been inside researching a school project about local history when his front wheel got caught in a sidewalk crack. "I can fix this, Dad," Tommy said, trying to use his small hands to pop the wheel back into place. "I just need to push harder." "Take your time, buddy," I told him, kneeling down to examine the problem. "Sometimes the best solution is not the obvious one." That was when Sheriff Karen Walsh pulled up in her patrol car, lights flashing but no sirens. She climbed out of the vehicle like she was responding to a major crime scene, her hand resting on her service weapon as she approached us. "What is going on here?" she demanded, her voice sharp and aggressive. She was a tall woman in her 40s, with short gray hair and cold blue eyes that seemed to look right through people. "Just a mechanical issue with my son's wheelchair," I explained calmly. "Nothing to worry about, officer." "Sheriff," she corrected me with obvious irritation. "Sheriff Walsh, and I will decide what is worth worrying about in my town." Tommy looked up at her with innocent curiosity. "Hi, Sheriff. I am Tommy. Do you know anything about wheelchair repair?" Karen stared down at him with an expression I will never forget. It was not just annoyance or impatience. It was disgust. Pure, undisguised disgust at the sight of a disabled child asking for help. "I know that broken equipment blocking public sidewalks is a safety hazard," she said coldly. "And I know that some people create problems for everyone else just by existing." The words hit me like a physical blow. I felt my jaw clench and my hands ball into fists, but I forced myself to stay calm. Getting into a confrontation with the local sheriff would not help Tommy, and it could compromise my undercover investigation. "We will have this fixed in just a few minutes," I said evenly. "No safety hazard here." "That remains to be seen," Karen replied, pulling out a small notebook and pen. "Name?" "David Miller," I said, using my cover identity. "This is my son Tommy." "Address?" I gave her our rental house address on Maple Street. She wrote everything down with exaggerated care, as if we were dangerous criminals she needed to track. "Let me be clear about something, Mr. Miller," she said, stepping closer to me. "This is a quiet, family-friendly community. We do not tolerate people who create disruptions or draw unwanted attention to themselves." Tommy was still struggling with his wheel, completely unaware that this woman was essentially threatening us. His innocent determination to solve his own problem made Karen's cruelty even more shocking. "People come to Millbrook because they want normal, peaceful lives," she continued. "They do not want to deal with special needs drama or constant accessibility issues. Do I make myself clear?" I looked into her eyes and saw something that chilled me to the bone. This was not just prejudice or ignorance. This was active malice toward a vulnerable child who had never done anything wrong except being born different. "Crystal clear," I said quietly. Karen smiled then, a cold expression that never reached her eyes. "Good. I hope we understand each other." She walked back to her patrol car and drove away without another word. Tommy finally got his wheel fixed and looked up at me with a confused expression. "Dad, why was she so mean?" he asked. I helped him into his wheelchair and pushed him toward home, my mind already racing with implications. "Some people are just having bad days, Tommy. It is not about you." But I knew it was about him. It was about his wheelchair, his differences, and Karen's twisted belief that disabled people were somehow less deserving of basic human dignity. That night, after Tommy went to bed, I sat at my kitchen table and started a new file. Not for my official investigation, but for documenting every interaction we had with Sheriff Karen Walsh. Something told me we would be seeing a lot more of her. Over the next 6 weeks, Sheriff Karen made our lives a living hell. What started as one uncomfortable encounter became a systematic campaign of harassment that followed us everywhere we went in Millbrook. The first incident happened at the grocery store. Tommy and I were shopping for our weekly groceries when Karen appeared at the end of our aisle. She watched us for several minutes, making notes in her little book every time Tommy reached for something on a lower shelf or asked me to grab items he could not reach. "Excuse me," she said loudly, causing other shoppers to turn and stare. Are you aware that your son is creating a safety hazard by blocking the aisle with his wheelchair? I looked around the aisle, which was completely empty except for us. There is nobody else here, Sheriff. That is not the point, she replied. The point is that this wheelchair takes up excessive space and prevents normal customers from shopping efficiently. Tommy looked up at me with worried eyes. Dad, should we leave? No, buddy, I said, keeping my voice calm. We have every right to shop here. But Karen was not finished. She called over the store manager, a nervous man named Bill who clearly did not want to get involved in whatever was happening. Bill, I need you to be aware that this customer is creating accessibility issues for other shoppers, she said officially. I would hate to have to cite the store for ADA violations. The threat was completely backwards. If anything, the store was required to accommodate Tommy, not restrict his access. But Bill did not know that, and Karen was counting on his ignorance. Maybe you folks could shop during off-peak hours, Bill suggested weakly. Less crowded that way. I wanted to explain the law to him, but causing a scene would only make things worse for Tommy. We finished our shopping quickly and left, while Karen followed us to the parking lot and wrote down my license plate number. The harassment escalated from there. Karen started showing up everywhere we went. School pickup, the library, the park, even church on Sunday mornings. She would find pretend reasons to approach us, ask for identification, and create public scenes that made other people uncomfortable. Dad, why does she always show up wherever we go? Tommy asked after Karen interrupted his chess club meeting to investigate reports of disruptive behavior. I do not know, son, I said honestly, but we are not doing anything wrong. The worst part was watching Tommy internalize the harassment. He started asking if we could avoid certain places, if maybe he should stay home instead of going to community events, if his wheelchair was really causing problems for other people. Maybe I should not join the chess club, he said one evening. Sheriff Karen says I take up too much space. Tommy, look at me, I said, kneeling down to his eye level. There is nothing wrong with you or your wheelchair. Sheriff Karen is the one with the problem, not you. But kids Tommy's age do not always understand adult cruelty. They tend to blame themselves when adults treat them badly, especially adults in positions of authority like police officers. Karen began recruiting other deputies to help with the harassment. Deputy Stevens started following us to the grocery store. Deputy Martinez began showing up at Tommy's school, claiming to investigate reports of disruptive behavior that never actually existed. The worst incident happened at the community center. Tommy was watching a basketball game when Deputy Stevens approached him and demanded to search his backpack. Why? Tommy asked innocently. Because the sheriff says you people are probably dealing drugs, Stevens replied loudly enough for everyone to hear. The accusation was so ridiculous it would have been funny if it were not so cruel. Tommy was 12 years old, disabled, and one of the most innocent kids I had ever known. But the damage was done. Other parents started looking at us suspiciously, whispering among themselves, keeping their children away from Tommy. I documented every incident, every false accusation, every public humiliation, every attempt to isolate us from the community. My training as a police chief helped me recognize the pattern of systematic harassment, but my role as a father made it almost unbearable to watch. The breaking point came when Mrs. Henderson at the grocery store stopped saving apples for Tommy. I am sorry, she said quietly when I asked about it. Sheriff Walsh says I should not show special treatment to certain customers. She says it creates problems. That night, Tommy asked me a question that broke my heart. "Dad, are we bad people?" "No, Tommy," I said, holding him close. "We are not bad people, but some people in positions of power abuse that power, and it is never okay." I was still maintaining my cover identity, still pretending to be just another single father trying to get by. But Karen's harassment was pushing me toward a decision point. Soon, I would have to choose between protecting my investigation and protecting my son. Looking back, I should have known there was no real choice to make. The day Sheriff Karen destroyed Tommy's wheelchair started like any other Tuesday. I dropped Tommy off at school and went to the hardware store to buy supplies for a small repair job around the house. Tommy was planning to stay after school for chess club, so I would pick him up at 4:30 outside the community center. What I did not know was that Karen had been watching our routine, waiting for the perfect moment to strike when Tommy would be alone and vulnerable. At 4:15, I got a phone call from Tommy. His voice was shaking and barely audible through his tears. "Dad, please come quickly," he whispered. "Sheriff Karen took my wheelchair." I dropped everything and raced toward the community center, my heart pounding with fear and rage. As I turned the corner onto Main Street, I saw smoke rising from the parking lot behind the building. I parked and ran around the back, where I found the most horrifying scene of my life. Tommy was sitting on the ground, tears streaming down his face, staring at the burning remains of his custom wheelchair. Sheriff Karen stood nearby with two deputies, watching the flames with satisfaction. "There he is," Karen said when she saw me approaching. "Come to collect your burden." "What have you done?" I shouted, kneeling down next to Tommy and pulling him into my arms. "Disposed of a safety hazard," she replied calmly. "This defective equipment was creating liability issues for the community center. We had reports of children tripping over it." The lie was so outrageous I could barely process it. Tommy's wheelchair was a precision-built medical device that cost $12,000. It was his mobility, his independence, his connection to the world. And she had destroyed it like it was garbage. "That wheelchair was medically necessary equipment," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You have just committed destruction of property and violated federal disability rights laws." Karen laughed. "Good luck proving that in court, Miller. My report will show that we confiscated dangerous equipment that posed a threat to public safety." "You cannot do this," I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I realized she already had. Tommy was sobbing against my chest, his small body shaking with fear and confusion. "Dad, how am I going to get around? How am I going to go to school?" "We will figure it out, buddy," I promised him, but inside I was falling apart. Karen stepped closer, her voice dropping to a threatening whisper. "Let me make something very clear, Miller. This town does not want you here. This town does not need you here. Take your boy and find somewhere else to live because things are only going to get worse." Deputy Stevens was filming the conversation on his phone, obviously planning to edit the footage to support whatever false narrative they intended to create. Deputy Martinez stood guard to make sure no civilians could interfere or record what was really happening. But they had made one crucial mistake. 3 local teenagers had been hanging out behind the community center when the incident started, and they had filmed everything on their phones. They recorded Karen confiscating the wheelchair under false pretenses. They recorded her setting it on fire. They recorded her threatening us afterward. "This is not over," I told Karen, lifting Tommy in my arms and carrying him toward my car. "Yes, it is," she called after me. "Pack your bags, Miller. You have 48 hours to get out of my town." I drove Tommy home in stunned silence, both of us processing what had just happened. His wheelchair was gone. His independence was gone. His sense of safety in the world had been shattered by a corrupt police officer who saw him as nothing more than an inconvenience to be eliminated. That night, after I helped Tommy into bed and assured him that everything would be okay, I sat at my kitchen table and made a decision that would change everything. I opened my laptop and accessed secure communication channels that I had not used since arriving in Millbrook. I sent encrypted messages to contacts at the FBI, the Justice Department, and Internal Affairs divisions in 3 different counties. Then I called my supervisor at the state police. "Chief Morrison," he said when he answered, "how is the undercover investigation going?" "The investigation is about to become very personal," I told him. "I need full tactical support and legal backup. Someone just crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed." "What happened?" I told him about Karen, about the harassment, about the wheelchair, about my son crying himself to sleep in the next room. When I finished, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. "David," he said finally, "you know that revealing your identity will compromise the entire operation." "I know," I replied, "but some things are more important than any investigation." "What do you need?" "I need Karen Walsh and her entire department investigated for civil rights violations, abuse of power, and destruction of property. I need media attention and federal oversight, and I need it all to happen in the most public way possible." "Consider it done." After I hung up the phone, I walked into Tommy's room and sat down beside his bed. He was still awake, staring at the ceiling with red eyes. "Dad, are we going to move away like she said?" "No, Tommy," I said quietly. "We are not going anywhere. Sheriff Karen just made the biggest mistake of her life, and tomorrow she is going to learn exactly who she has been messing with." The morning after Karen destroyed Tommy's wheelchair, I woke up at 5 a.m. and began executing a plan that had been forming in my mind all night. Tommy was still sleeping, exhausted from crying and trauma, so I worked quietly in the kitchen with my laptop and secure phone. My first call was to Agent Rebecca Santos at the FBI Civil Rights Division. Rebecca and I had worked together on several cases involving police misconduct, and she owed me a favor from a corruption case in Detroit 2 years earlier. "David Morrison," she said when she answered. "I heard about what happened to your son. I am so sorry." "Thank you, Rebecca. I need your help to make this right." "What do you need?" "Full federal investigation into Sheriff Karen Walsh and the Millbrook Police Department. Civil rights violations, abuse of power, destruction of property, and systematic harassment of disabled individuals." "Send me everything you have," she said immediately. "Video evidence, witness statements, documentation of the harassment pattern. We can have a team there by Thursday." My second call was to District Attorney Michael Chen, whose office had jurisdiction over Millbrook County. Michael was a former prosecutor who specialized in police misconduct cases, and he had a reputation for being thorough and fearless. "This is exactly the kind of case my office was created to handle," Michael said after I explained the situation. "We will coordinate with the FBI and make sure Karen Walsh faces both criminal charges and federal civil rights violations." While Tommy slept, I spent 3 hours organizing evidence. Photos of every harassment incident, audio recordings of threats and false accusations, witness contact information, medical documentation proving Tommy's need for specialized mobility equipment, financial records showing the wheelchair's cost and my insurance coverage. The teenagers who had filmed Karen destroying the wheelchair were named Jake, Maria, and Connor. I contacted their parents and explained the situation, asking permission to use their footage as evidence. All three families agreed immediately, disgusted by what they had witnessed. Sheriff Walsh has been bullying people in this town for years, Jake's mother told me. Nobody has ever had the courage to stand up to her before. Well, that is about to change, I replied. My most important call was to Judge Patricia Williams, who presided over the regional courthouse. Judge Williams had served on the bench for 15 years and had a reputation for fairness and integrity. I had testified in her courtroom several times during my career as police chief. "Chief Morrison," she said when I identified myself. "I heard rumors that you were working undercover in this area. I assume this call is related to that investigation." "Partially," I said, "but mostly it is related to my son being victimized by a corrupt sheriff who needs to be removed from office immediately." I told her the entire story, from our first encounter with Karen to the wheelchair destruction. Judge Williams listened without interruption, occasionally asking clarifying questions about dates and witnesses. "This is appalling," she said when I finished. "What do you need from me?" "I need a public forum where Karen Walsh can be confronted with evidence of her crimes in front of the entire community. I want everyone in Millbrook to see exactly who they have been allowing to terrorize their neighbors." "The town council meeting is tomorrow night," she said. "I can arrange for a special session focused on police conduct and community safety. Will that work?" "Perfect." My final preparation was the hardest one. I had to tell Tommy the truth about who I really was and what was going to happen next. I woke him up gently and helped him into the spare wheelchair we had borrowed from the medical supply store. It was uncomfortable and poorly fitted, but it would have to do until we could get his custom chair replaced. "Tommy, I need to tell you something important about my job," I began. He looked at me with curious eyes. "Are you not a construction worker?" "No, buddy. I am actually a police chief from the next county over. I have been working undercover here, which means I had to pretend to be someone else for my job." Tommy processed this information slowly. "So you are like a super cop." "Something like that. And tomorrow night, I am going to use my real job to make sure Sheriff Karen pays for what she did to you." "Will I get my wheelchair back?" "You will get a better wheelchair than before," I promised him. "And Sheriff Karen will never hurt anyone else the way she hurt you." For the first time since the incident, Tommy smiled. "Can I watch when you arrest her?" "You can do better than watch," I told him. "You can help me make sure justice is served." The Millbrook Community Center was packed beyond capacity on Wednesday evening. Word had spread through the small town that there would be a special town council meeting about police conduct, and everyone wanted to see what would happen. Tommy and I arrived early and took seats in the front row, his borrowed wheelchair squeaking with every movement. Sheriff Karen Walsh entered the room at exactly 7 p.m., flanked by Deputies Stevens and Martinez. She wore her full uniform with extra decorations, clearly intending to intimidate anyone who might challenge her authority. Her confidence was obvious as she surveyed the crowd, nodding to supporters and glaring at potential troublemakers. "Good evening, everyone," Mayor Johnson said from the podium. "We are here tonight to discuss recent concerns about police conduct in our community. Sheriff Walsh will have an opportunity to address any questions or complaints." Karen stood up and walked to the front of the room, her boots clicking loudly on the wooden floor. "I want to be very clear about something," she began. "The Millbrook Police Department operates with full transparency and complete adherence to the law. Any suggestions otherwise are false and potentially slanderous." She looked directly at Tommy and me as she spoke, her message unmistakable. She was daring us to challenge her in public, confident that a disabled child and his apparently powerless father posed no real threat to her position. However, she continued, we have had some issues with certain newcomers who refuse to follow local regulations and create problems for long-term residents. Sometimes law enforcement has to take decisive action to protect the community. Several people in the audience nodded approvingly. These were Karen's supporters, people who either benefited from her corruption or were too intimidated to oppose her. Sheriff Walsh, Mayor Johnson said, there have been specific allegations about the destruction of medical equipment belonging to a disabled child. Can you address those concerns? Absolutely, Karen replied with fake sincerity. My department confiscated a defective wheelchair that posed safety hazards to other community members. The equipment was disposed of according to standard protocols for dangerous materials. The lie was so bold and shameless that several people gasped audibly. Tommy reached over and squeezed my hand, his small fingers trembling with nervousness. That is a very interesting version of events, I said, standing up slowly. But I have a different perspective to share. Karen turned to face me with obvious annoyance. Mr. Miller, you will have an opportunity to speak during the public comment period. Actually, I said, reaching into my jacket pocket and pulling out my badge and credentials, I think I will speak now. The room fell completely silent as I held up my police chief badge, where everyone could see it clearly. My name is not David Miller, I announced in a clear, carrying voice. My name is Police Chief David Morrison from Hamilton County. I have been working undercover in this community for the past 4 months, and I have personally witnessed Sheriff Walsh commit multiple felonies. Karen's face went white. Her mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. The confident authority figure from moments earlier had disappeared, replaced by a woman who suddenly realized she was in serious trouble. That is impossible, she stammered. You are just a construction worker. You live in a rental house on Maple Street. I am a 20-year veteran of law enforcement with commendations from the FBI and Justice Department, I continued. And yesterday, I watched you commit arson, destruction of property, and federal civil rights violations against my disabled son. I pulled out my phone and connected it to the community center's projection system. The video footage from the teenagers began playing on the large screen, showing Karen confiscating Tommy's wheelchair under false pretenses and then setting it on fire. The audience watched in stunned silence as Karen's voice came through the speakers. This is what happens to burdens on society. When the video ended, the room erupted in angry voices. People who had been silent during months of Karen's abuse suddenly found their courage. She gave my nephew a speeding ticket for going 25 in a 30 zone. She arrested my daughter for jaywalking. She told my disabled mother that handicapped parking was for paying customers only. Karen tried to regain control of the situation. This is obviously a setup. That video could be fake. This man is probably not even a real police officer. Agent Rebecca Santos chose that moment to enter the room, followed by 3 other FBI agents and District Attorney Michael Chen. They walked straight to Karen Walsh and surrounded her. Sheriff Karen Walsh, Agent Santos announced loudly, you are under arrest for federal civil rights violations, destruction of property, and abuse of power under color of law. The handcuffs clicking around Karen's wrists was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. Her shocked expression as she realized her career was over made every moment of harassment and humiliation worth it. "This is not over," she shouted as the agents led her toward the door. "You cannot do this to me." "Actually," I called after her, "this is exactly what happens when you mess with the wrong family." Tommy looked up at me with pride shining in his eyes. "Dad, you are like a superhero." "No, buddy," I said, putting my arm around his shoulders. "I am just a father who loves his son." The weeks following Karen's arrest moved quickly as federal investigators descended on Millbrook like a swarm of determined bees. Agent Santos established a field office in the old bank building on Main Street, and within days they had uncovered a pattern of corruption that shocked even me. Karen Walsh was not just a prejudiced bully. She was the center of a systematic scheme that had been exploiting Millbrook residents for over 3 years. She had been taking bribes from local businesses, planting evidence on people she wanted to remove from town, and using her position to intimidate anyone who challenged her authority. "The evidence is overwhelming," District Attorney Chen told me during a briefing at the FBI field office. "Falsified police reports, illegal property seizures, witness intimidation, and at least 12 cases of civil rights violations against disabled individuals." Tommy was not Karen's only victim. The investigation revealed that she had targeted every disabled person in Millbrook, forcing several families to move away rather than endure constant harassment. Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman with a walker, had been cited for obstructing pedestrian traffic 17 times in 6 months. The Gonzalez family had been driven out of town after Karen repeatedly arrested their autistic son for disturbing the peace when he had meltdowns in public. "How did this go on for so long without anyone reporting it?" I asked Agent Santos. "Fear," she replied simply. Karen Walsh created an atmosphere of terror where people were afraid to speak up. She had convinced the town council that she was protecting them from undesirable elements. The investigation expanded to include deputies Stevens and Martinez, who had been Karen's willing accomplices in most of her crimes. Stevens was charged with falsifying evidence and witness intimidation. Martinez faced charges for assault and battery against a mentally disabled teenager who had allegedly resisted arrest during a completely fabricated traffic stop. Judge Williams held a special hearing to review every case Karen had handled during her tenure as sheriff. Dozens of convictions were overturned, fines were refunded, and the county faced millions of dollars in civil rights lawsuits. The media attention was intense but mostly positive. Local news stations ran stories about the corrupt sheriff who had terrorized disabled children. National outlets picked up the story as an example of how federal oversight could protect vulnerable communities from abusive local officials. Former sheriff faces federal charges for burning disabled child's wheelchair. Read the headline in USA Today. The article included a photo of Tommy in his new, even better wheelchair that had been donated by a medical equipment company after they saw the news coverage. The community response was everything I had hoped for and more. People who had been silent during Karen's reign of terror stepped forward to apologize and offer support. Mrs. Henderson at the grocery store started a fund to replace specialized equipment for other disabled residents who had been victimized. "I am so ashamed that I let fear stop me from helping your family," she told me with tears in her eyes. Karen Walsh told us that speaking up would bring federal attention we did not want. Now I realize that federal attention was exactly what we needed. The most satisfying moment came when Judge Williams sentenced Karen Walsh to 5 years in federal prison and permanent removal from law enforcement. Karen stood in the courtroom wearing an orange jumpsuit instead of her sheriff's uniform, her arrogance finally replaced by the reality of consequences. Your actions represented the worst abuse of power I have seen in 20 years on the bench, Judge Williams told her. You took an oath to protect and serve your community, and instead you terrorized the most vulnerable members of that community. Karen's lawyer tried to argue for leniency, claiming she had been under stress and made poor decisions. But the evidence was too overwhelming, the pattern too clear, and the victims too numerous. Tommy attended the sentencing hearing, sitting proudly in his new wheelchair and watching justice being served. When Karen was led away in handcuffs, he looked up at me with satisfaction. Dad, does this mean she can never hurt anyone else? That is exactly what it means, buddy. Deputies Stevens and Martinez received shorter sentences, but were also permanently banned from law enforcement. The entire Millbrook Police Department was placed under federal oversight for 3 years to prevent similar corruption in the future. The civil lawsuits were settled out of court for undisclosed amounts, but I knew the money would help other families who had been victimized by Karen's systematic abuse. More importantly, the precedent was set that disabled individuals have the same rights as everyone else, and those rights would be protected by federal law. Tommy and I decided to stay in Millbrook permanently. The investigation was complete. My cover was blown, but we had found something more valuable than any undercover operation could provide. We had found a community that had learned to stand up for what was right. 6 months after Karen Walsh was led away in handcuffs, Millbrook had transformed into the kind of community Tommy and I had originally hoped to find. The federal oversight had cleaned out the corruption, and new leadership had emerged that actually cared about serving all residents equally. The new sheriff was Maria Santos, a former FBI agent and Rebecca's younger sister who had applied for the position specifically because she wanted to rebuild trust between law enforcement and the community. Her first act was to create a civilian oversight board that included advocates for disabled rights, elderly residents, and minority families. Every person in this community deserves equal protection and equal treatment, Sheriff Santos announced at her swearing-in ceremony. The badge is a tool for service, not a weapon for intimidation. Tommy had become something of a local celebrity, though he handled the attention with typical 12-year-old grace. His new wheelchair was even better than his original one, with improved suspension, better maneuverability, and custom features that made his daily life easier. More importantly, he had found his voice as an advocate for disability rights. The trauma of having his wheelchair destroyed had given way to determination to make sure no other disabled child would face similar treatment. I want to start a club at school for kids with disabilities, he told me over breakfast one morning. We can teach other people what it is like to need accommodations, and maybe they will not be scared of us anymore. That sounds like an excellent idea, buddy. What would you call this club? The Wheelchair Warriors, he said with a grin, because we fight for what is right. The community center had installed new accessibility features and created programs specifically designed to include disabled residents. The chess club that Tommy had been afraid to join now met in a fully accessible room, and Tommy had become their star player. Mrs. Henderson at the grocery store had done more than just apologize. She had worked with the store management to improve accessibility throughout the building, adding lower shelves, wider aisles, and better lighting for people with various disabilities. Your family taught us that inclusion is not just about following laws, she told me. It is about recognizing that everyone has value and everyone deserves dignity. The federal investigation had also uncovered the larger corruption network I had originally been sent to investigate. Karen's crimes were connected to a multi-county scheme involving drug trafficking, money laundering, and political corruption. My undercover work, combined with the evidence from her civil rights violations, led to 17 additional arrests and the dismantling of a criminal organization that had been operating for over 5 years. You accomplished more in 6 months of personal investigation than we had managed in 2 years of traditional surveillance, my supervisor told me during my performance review. Your willingness to sacrifice your cover for your son's safety led to the biggest corruption bust in state history. I had been offered promotions and transfers to larger departments, but Tommy and I had decided to stay in Millbrook. The town had become our home in the truest sense, earned through struggle and validated through community support. The house on Maple Street was no longer a temporary rental. We had bought it, painted Tommy's room his favorite shade of blue, and built a ramp to the front door that became a neighborhood gathering spot where kids would skateboard and Tommy would race his wheelchair. "Dad, do you ever regret moving here?" Tommy asked me one evening as we sat on our front porch watching the sunset. "Never," I said honestly. "This place taught us both what we are capable of when we stand up for what is right. Even with all the bad stuff that happened." "Especially because of the bad stuff," I replied. "Bad things happen everywhere, Tommy. The difference is whether people choose to fight back or stay silent." Tommy nodded thoughtfully. "I am glad we fought back." "Me too, buddy, me too." The story of Sheriff Karen Walsh became a cautionary tale taught in police academies across the country. Her photograph appeared in training materials about abuse of power, with Tommy's wheelchair fire serving as a stark reminder of how quickly authority can become tyranny without proper oversight. But for Tommy and me, the real victory was not Karen's imprisonment or the media attention, or even the justice system working as it should. The real victory was watching Tommy grow from a frightened child who thought he was a burden into a confident young man who knew his worth and was willing to fight for others. "Dad, when I grow up, I want to be like you," he told me one day. "What do you mean?" "I want to protect people who cannot protect themselves. I want to make sure bullies get stopped before they hurt anyone." You are already doing that, Tommy. Every day you show people that being different is not the same as being less than. That is the most important kind of protection there is. As I write this story, Tommy is now 15 years old and serves on the Millbrook Community Council as the youngest member in the town's history. He advocates for accessibility improvements, speaks at schools about disability awareness, and has never let anyone make him feel like he does not belong. Sheriff Karen Walsh is serving her sentence in federal prison, where she will remain for 3 more years. She will never work in law enforcement again, and her name has become synonymous with the kind of abuse that federal oversight exists to prevent. The wheelchair she destroyed was worth $12,000. The community she terrorized was priceless. The lesson she learned about consequences was long overdue. But the most important outcome was not about Karen Walsh at all. It was about a small town that learned to stand up for its most vulnerable members, and a disabled child who learned that his voice matters just as much as anyone else's. Justice is not always swift, and it is not always certain. But when it comes, it can transform not just individual lives but entire communities. Tommy and I learned that the hard way in Millbrook, and we would not change a single moment of it.